There were a few comments on the channel the other day from somebody who I think may be a relatively new viewer. They'd never commented before, and they left 3 or 4 comments in rapid succession, all focusing on how science fiction seemed to be, from my point of view, all doom and gloom. And they were saying, where's the happy SF? Where's the hope? And I typically counteracted that with my usual sort of comments on the lines of, it is the business of the future to be dangerous, which I'm always quoting that from Whitehead, as you know, and really saying that the social function of SF wasn't really a humorous one, and that you couldn't really have happy SF, but you could only have SF which possibly ended in hope, because you wouldn't have drama. And this is why happy fiction is such a shallow thing and such a poor thing artistically, and why it's a relatively uncommon thing. Though in the book trade at the moment we are seeing an overwhelming wave of coziness, the whole Japanese cat, cafe, bookshop, time travel type things, and there's a lot of coziness erupting. But usually it doesn't make for great art, because you need that conflict to get drama, to drive plot through character, through conflict and what have you. So, it did make me think a bit, and it just happened that I picked up a book, my next science fiction read, which really sort of brought those things into relief. And more importantly, it made me laugh a lot, which is, let's be honest, I mean, we could all do with more laughter. It's a very it's a great thing, and it's a healing thing. And that book was the very wonderful Count Geiger's Blues by Michael Bishop from 1992. And I'm a bit of a Bishop fan. I included his book Ancient of Days in my book 100 must-read science fiction novels, and I've read quite a few things by him, and his work falls into distinct phases, and I just really want to talk about this. And the thing about hope is that, sometimes it's naive, but sometimes it's all we've got. And when this book came out, I was in a period then when I was falling out of love with science fiction, with the way it was going, and even though I like Bishop's work, I didn't read it at that time. But it is an absolutely fantastic book, and I'm going to tell you why I think that's the case. What it actually does is it riffs on superhero tropes. And as you can see from the title, Count Geiger's Blues, and there's Count Geiger there, who was a sort of cobalt Superman. And this was published by Tor. Very beautiful book. I think it's out of print now, but you should try and get it. And it's got a really great plot, loads of jokes. But at the heart of it, it is a serious book, but it says an awful lot about an awful lot, and that way it really blew me away. The central character is one Xavier Thaxton, and of course Xavier, straight away you think of Professor X from the X-Men. And Xavier Thaxton is a newspaper columnist of a kind, rather like Clark Kent, so there's instantly a Superman reference there. That's in his secret identity. He's basically the chief arts editor of a newspaper called the Salonika Urbanite, and he is a very urbane chap. And Salonika is a fictional city in the southern United States. You could say it's near future, you could say it's an alternate history. And it's a seemingly utopian city with lots of gleaming skyscrapers, but it does have some urban sinkholes where some low life goes on, some drug abuse and some sort of sideshow type things, which I'm laughing at as I think of now, involving beer and water pistols and scantily clad ladies. But that's just one thing I'm letting out there. But Xavier Thaxton, he's a nice guy. He's a great guy. He's got a very comfortable life. He's got a really nice sort of condominium. He is a bit of a snob. He knows everything about high culture, classical music, opera, ballet, drama, literature and film. But he's very ignorant in a sense, and by ignorant I mean he doesn't know about the things he dismisses. Low culture, he thinks the TV, rock music and comic books are all crap, when of course, a more well-balanced critic knows that in every form there are things which are really good, no matter how low that form may appear to be, and there are things which are really bad. So there is that spectrum, but Xavier seems ignorant of this. He has a stunning girlfriend called Barry, who is a haute couture designer who is rising in her profession, and she's going to be one of the big names in high fashion. And all seems rosy in his life until Xavier's sister Lydia, who is a foreign aid do-gooder, dumps her teenage retro punk son on his uncle, while she and her husband just fly off to Bangladesh to do something decent and just neglect their son, leaving him with his uncle. And Xavier takes the boy on, and said adolescent is called Mikhail, or the Mick. And the Mick is probably the towering genius character of this book. And he's an irreverent but charming, to the reader at least, rebel. And he loves indie superhero comic books, punk rock, and all sorts of things which are bad for you, like greasy food. And he's quite happy to go and live with his uncle, despite his uncle being a bit uptight, because Uncommon Comics, the new indie comic publisher who are rivaling Marvel and DC in this alternate world, are based in Salonika. The Mick is happy to attend school, even if it means shaving off his mohawk and wearing the school uniform, just so he can be near to Uncommon Comics. And he struggles at school with both classic 19th century novels and modernism, and there is much dialogue between the Mick and his Uncle Save, as he calls him, about these things. He also relishes skateboarding. He worships avant-garde band Smite Them Hip and Thigh, possibly the coolest band name ever. And of course he digs fast food, as I say, rather than nouvelle cuisine. And a kind of war of words erupts between Xavier and the Mick. And this is where Bishop's vertiginous skill with comedic dialogue and jocular situations really flies, because Bishop is a wit, and his observation ability with characters, both central and supporting, and there are plenty of those and they're beautifully drawn, rivals that of Thomas M. Dish, who is one of his admitted influences. Only a novelist as conversant with culture both high and low could depict the thrust and parry of Xavier's highfalutin standards with the more street-level integrity that the Mick so warmly effuses. The Mick's antics in rock and roll, skateboarding, and, general low culture reminded me of a lot of books. They reminded me of Ray Nelson's Virtual Zen, which I reviewed on the channel a few years ago, which is about a rock band in the future. Really good, fun little book. The whole tone reminded me of the satirical thrust of Mark Laidlaw's Dad's Nuke, a very funny book from the 1980s, which I should really review here at some point. And also the street sort of attitude of Lewis Shiner's mainstream novel Slam, which, as you might have guessed on the cover, is about skateboarding to a degree. It's also about low life as well. So those things all flashed in my head while I was reading Count Geiger's Blues. Using this relationship between the two key characters to make observational comments about popular media like comics, which had just before this, a few years before this, reached their apogee. The mid to late 80s was the key moment when a lot of British writers and creators started working for DC, for example, at things like Watchmen, The Dark Knight Returns, all those things popped up there. Yeah, and I know Frank Miller's in there as well, but it was a key period when superhero comics particularly seemed to come of age, and then there was a crash into commercialism in the early 90s, around about the time this book came out. So there's also some gentle parody of cyberpunk in here, and the generational conflict between the Mick and Xavier is foregrounded. But from the prologue onwards, the reader knows there is a science fiction scenario which gradually unfolds throughout the book with beautiful stateliness, which is really testament to Bishop's genius of plotting. For Xavier has been unwittingly exposed in a rural setting to some illegally dumped radioactive waste, which will lead to his eventual emergence as Count Geiger, the silver-clad superhero. But before this, he succumbs to a mysterious malady, which he realizes is sparked by exposure to his beloved high culture. He's keen on quoting Nietzsche in his mission to elevate the masses' taste to his level, but his ultimate transformation into a literal Ubermensch contrasts hilariously with his insecurity around the stasis in his courtship with Barry, which seems to slow down. She's focused on her career and next season's collection, and she seems reluctant to acquiesce to Xavier's desire to propose marriage to her. Meanwhile, the Mick balks at the schism between him and his Uncle Save, and he even goes AWOL at one point. The thing with Bishop is he really was a master of sophisticated but funny science fiction. He was subtler than Douglas Adams, tidier than Ron Goulart, more interested in plot that somebody like, say, Robert Sheckley was. I mean, I love Sheck, but sometimes his lack of plotting in a lot of the major books just drives people mad because it's incident after incident. He's less diverted by notion than people like Rudy Rucker or, say, for example, John Sladek. And in that respect, you know, his only superior is Thomas M. Dish, I would say, as a funny SF writer. And there are flashes of humour in his work in the 80s, but it becomes very pronounced in this. And this could have led to a whole new career for him, but it didn't happen for reasons we'll go into later. And this is his biggest belly laugh book, and it does get serious at the end, but I laughed and laughed and laughed. It's got Mortis and Tennant subplotting, a coruscating cast of supporting characters, and linguistic inventiveness and sheer readability, which wraps the book like the glitzy paper on a Belgian chocolate. This amazingly funny novel comments on comic books both as cliche and delight, and on the industry and fandom's own tendency to idolatry around the creators. And the creator of some of the comics in this is a character as well, and he has interesting interactions with Xavier as he becomes Count Geiger. I'm not going to tell you what they are. And there's the erasable dynamic between high culture and low artisanship, which underpins this book. So it is kind of a hymn to love of comic books and low culture, but without sacrificing any of its own high aesthetic achievement. It's not a book which is saying, let's be Luddites about this. There's room for good things in all media. This made me laugh a lot more than Kurt Vonnegut's Breakfast of Champions, because Bishop is never as preachy as Kurt Vonnegut was. And at his best, he's the equal as a writer. And it's a real shame he didn't do more like this. Balance, really, was Michael Bishop's key strength. And there's so much in this book that I laughed and laughed at. I never felt Bishop was trying to get a cheap guffaw out of me. It was the sheer genius and placement of words in sentences, snappy and sharp and fleet. The giggles are earthy, but they're sophisticated. They're kind of elemental iron and water. They're deft yet telling. High wire comic timing was his forte. And he weaves this immaculately into the plot, you know. But Bishop was a mature artist, recognizing that only by realizing that tragedy must exist in life can we find hope in laughter. And this does have some tragedy in it. And it's dealt with very lightly and very respectfully, and with great humanity, which is something that Bishop always displayed, because he was one of the great humanist SF writers. I mean, that's there in his early work from the 70s, a lot of which is anthropological, religious. It's very ornate and coloured, and he toned that style down as he went into the 80s. I mean, books like Beneath the Shattered Moons, also known as At Strange at Ectoban the Trees, A Funeral for the Eyes of Fire. You know, these are quite ornate, colourful books set on alien planets, what have you. And when he came down to earth, Bishop actually improved as a writer, and through the 80s he did some really fantastic work. Let's say this was 92. He only did one major novel after this, around about the same time, a book called Brittle Innings, which I haven't read and I must really get to. And really after this, his career didn't sort of go anywhere. He never really matched the market, and it's weird because in the early 90s, when a lot of humanist SF was taking over, a lot of very sheeny, perfect surface stuff, which, like Brian Alder said, had the appearance of literature that wasn't. Bishop fell by the wayside. He was simply too demanding, which I find baffling because he's incredibly readable and funny. And I would say to anybody who likes mainstream fiction that give him a read, because he's so witty. He's up there with Vonnegut and Dish, as I say, and sometimes surpasses Vonnegut. Certainly at his best, he surpasses Vonnegut's sort of middle sort of period when he's beginning to go downhill. What else can you say about him? You know, he was a lovely man. I never met him, but we interacted a few times online via emails. He was always so humble and charming, and sadly he died of cancer in 2023, which has some affinities with some of the plot of this book, because there is a serious plot behind it. There is the revelation of a powerful villain who is pulling strings behind things, another classic superhero comic cliche which we find is realized in life, because very often the rich and powerful are pulling the strings. And you know, he had some personal tragedy. One of his sons was killed in an American college shooting, something that, you know, he and his wife and his whole family didn't deserve. So there is a sad underlying to this, but there is hope in it, and that's the thing. So if you've never read Bishop, you know, I do say pick him up. I have talked about him before on the channel. Other favourites by him include this book, Philip K. Dick is Dead, Alas, also known as The Secret Ascension, which everybody who loves Philip K. Dick should read. There's another one called Ancient of Days, I think I've mentioned that. And he was a great writer, you know. So if you want to really, really laugh and enjoy a book that is so sparkling, it's like sort of glass of champagne, but with a kind of sweetness to it, but underlying seriousness, Count Geiger's Blues is the one. I absolutely loved it. This is one of my favourite books since I started the channel. The things which have really turned me on going back to them are the works of Thomas M. Dish. And this sort of satirical, funny, humane, hopeful SF writing turns me on as much as the hard and bleak stuff. And of course, you have to remember that in America in the 1980s, it wasn't just cyberpunk, there was also the humanist writing going on as well. And there's some really great stuff out there. If you are wondering about that, check out my top 10 US SF males, cyberpunks versus humanists, or something like that. It's called. I'll try and put a link at the end. But if you can pick this up and read it, do, because it's fabulous. I laughed and laughed. I'm quite sad now because I don't know what I'm going to read next that will entertain me as much. It'll probably be something by Thomas M. Dish. This is Outlaw Bookseller. See you again soon. Bye for now.